really been quite a very eventful week for Nigeria and President Buhari, who was one of the African leaders in the just concluded US-Africa Leaders Summit. This will not be the Nigerian president's first involvement in that forum, but as he winds down his 8-year stewardship, presiding over the world's most populous black nation with limitless opportunities and possibilities, how best can Buhari's impact on Nigeria and Nigerians be appraised? Well, to have a conversation about that, we're now being joined by Professor Chika Mordi, adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies and chairman of United Capital PLC. Good morning, Prof. Good to have you join us today.
Morning, Stephen. Good morning, Abi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you indeed. You're welcome.
Steve, before you go any further, let me just say that one of the debates we're having about supporting African teams, and we must all support African teams. The question there is, what is an African team? I would argue that we have an African team in the finals because more than 8 out of 10 outfield players
the French
are from
team.
Sub-Saharan Africa originally, and Morocco has one from Sub-Saharan Africa. So in that sense, Africa should support France.
Absolutely. I mean, that's an interesting angle, Prof, because I remember when they played the semifinals, what a few people were saying was that, if Morocco claims to be Arab, then it looks like Arab is actually, facing an African team, because the French team is more African. But of course, this is good news for African footballers, whether they are wearing the Blues shirt or they are here playing, from the continent. We'll support an African team. So let's hope that Africa wins. We don't want to go into the goats, who's the better goats debate, but let's root for good football today and tomorrow. All right, Prof, thanks so much on that. Well, let's talk about the US-Africa Summit. I'm sure that you followed all the 3 days and the beautiful things that came out of it, what President Biden promised, and the way that it looks like President Muhammadu Buhari, had a fantastic outing, ending up with Joe Biden, describing him as a model of democracy in Africa. What are your thoughts on the specifics that came out of that summit? Yes, we know what America wanted to achieve, but do you think that Africa got a good deal participating in that second edition of the summit?
So there's a lot in there. Let me see how I share that and how I put that together. So first of all, I think it was a very fine moment for President Muhammadu Buhari because the Iconiums showered upon him by the most powerful man in the world. I also think that it was good for Africa in some senses, I would say. The most obvious thing was the package for $55 billion that the US president committed to. He also committed to, he didn't quite, wasn't specific about it, but he committed to visiting the continent as well. Now, how much of a good thing is that for Africa? Well, it's a step. $55 billion that wasn't there. It's better than having nothing. But the debate becomes, what is the best way to help Africa? And this is the way it's phrased, to help Africa, as against to work with Africa, to support Africa to help itself in terms of a sustainable intervention. And some argue with merit that giving aid to Africa, which is the model that has been used so far, does not work. And perhaps what they should be doing is to work with Africa so that there's a sustainable way of Africa developing and also reducing poverty or meeting whatever objectives that the US and indeed external players have for Africa that is well intended.
All right, Prof. As you mentioned earlier, we've also seen the US pledge towards support for elections and good governance in Africa next year. Of course, a number of countries, we've got the DRC, Gabon, Liberia, Madagascar, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, with upcoming polls next year. Now, these are countries with divergent growth drivers, political systems, and policy priorities. How, in your opinion, how pertinent and consequential would you say this pledge will be in bolstering the democratic process for these countries come next year?
There are two dimensions to this. The first dimension is the pledge itself. What will be the impact of that pledge? And then the second will be to follow through with the pledge and what tools are available to U.S. government and the degree of commitment in terms of utilizing those tools. In the first dimension, I think the pledge does matter. What has happened over the years on our continent has been that external validation is perhaps the most important thing for governments that may be illiberal. And so if they could constrain domestic resistance to an election that is not perceived as free and fair, they were very sensitive to how the United States or Western countries would feel, because very often they have no leverage. So when you're being lent funds and you're being supported, the same person could dictate or at least put pressure on you in terms of how you conduct yourself. Nigeria was not in this category until a few years ago because there was very little external debt. But now that we depend a lot on external borrowing to support our budget for almost day-to-day operations, then donor leverage is more significant. And that donor leverage is one of the bases they have to drive that. Now, the degree of commitment and the willingness to do that becomes also a challenge, because what has changed on the continent and the geopolitics is it's no longer an exclusive, or at least in the majority, Western external play. So you have new kids on the block, and you have some who have been on the block that have gotten bigger and wiser. But by this, I mean China is now, if not the largest for many countries, but the most significant or a very significant partner in terms of trade, in terms of lending, in terms of borrowing. We've seen the Gulf states get active here. We've seen India, we've seen Turkey, and we've seen Russia get active on the continent. And so it's not exclusively or near exclusively Western play. And so the influence they have, while it's still significant, is not as impactful as it used to be just a decade ago.
All right, but there was an additional $21 billion that Joe Biden said that he will ask the Congress for authority to lend $21 billion to the IMF to provide access, as you're aware, for low and mobile income countries. Again, this is just about, telling Africa that, yes, we will make money available to you. Is this the tone that the relationship between Africa and the US should be, providing money, whereas for the level of indebtedness that many African countries, have already, we're not hearing anything deep or concrete about debt relief, debt forgiveness, debt cancellation, etc. Should Africa really be piling up a lot more through IMF or whichever money America is trying to give? Should that be the direction for Africa?
No, and for two reasons. First of all, you're right, you're accurate, Steve, but it's total package of $55 billion. So this is part of what the US has said. I feel that, and I tried to allude to this earlier on, I feel that borrowing money or receiving aid, so aid is a good thing where there are specific interventions that are temporary, and it does not become a permanent feature of how a country funds itself. What we need more than anything else is to have domestic economic growth that is sustainable. So we can enhance productivity, we can increase the overall amount of economic output so that would drive unemployment, and that would drive great employment and reduce poverty. And this can be achieved by US trade, losing up trade with the continent, and investment as an actual investments that increase productive capacity as against just collecting aid. So the famous adage, you teach a man to fish, he doesn't go hungry. You give him fish, he goes hungry after a day, right? You feed him for a day. So we need to work on a partnership and this is the critical word, a partnership where we're working with the US to help the market to drive our economies. And there were, on the side of this summit, there were many discussions with the private sector and business leaders. In fact, there were Nigerians. There was the first session there's a session on Monday that the Tony Elumelu Foundation participated in. And some of the discussions around that was how the private sector could lead the growth around in Africa and interventions that will help the private sector because they're a more valuable, a more valuable source of reducing poverty in a consistent and sustainable manner.
All right, Prof, let's look at the powers at hand now. You had touched on geopolitics earlier. Let's look at the economic warfare between the US and China. Now, it is public knowledge that ties between both countries have soured over numerous points of tension in recent years, including trade issues, claim to the South China Sea, and then more recently, the push against Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. But when it comes to Africa, how grand or real would you say this warfare is? And more importantly, what position, in your opinion, of course, does this put Africa in?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, if you think of a bride that has suitors, a prospective bride, then that bride has more value where there are multiple suitors, and as against a single suitor. And forgive my use of that anecdote. What we've seen over the years is that the commitment that the US had to Africa and the degree of engagement had waned. So, especially during the Trump administration, where there was a significant amount of disengagement and there wasn't a clear African policy. So, when we go back in history and we go back 3 regimes ago, with AGOA and other things, right, you could be clear about where the policy stood. There was very little of that, and now we're seeing some increase in that engagement. What happened then was that vacuum was filled by external actors. China, number one, and I mentioned some countries earlier on, countries like Turkey, like India, to a lesser extent, countries like Russia, and we've seen Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates fill that space as well on the continent. The US interest used to be stronger when it was, you had counterterrorism, and this was all about jihadists across the country and trying to curb that. You had energy security. So Nigeria has to be a significant oil exporter to the US and Angola as well. And you had issues around climate change that we've discussed, which I would say to a lesser extent than those two. And you had the overall geopolitics in terms of the big power play. That significant changed as the US stopped importing oil from Africa as a whole. And a lot of the counterterrorism was relatively stable in terms of the ability of these transnational actors to project. So I think the bottom line is that you've had a change in sort of priority. Now, with the war in Ukraine, energy has come to the front burner again in terms of having alternative sources of oil and gas beyond the long-term movement away from hydrocarbons. Climate change remains on the cooker, if you like. Right now, the interests that China has are pretty more straightforward, and the US shares some of those interests. Right, so China is coming from a resource perspective, and that's the access to natural resources. And the second thing will be access to markets, if you like. The common factor for both of them is geopolitics. So you'll notice that when there was a vote in the UN in terms of human rights for Uyghurs in China, a surprising thing happened. And that was that the vote failed, and the majority of African countries voted against the interests of the US, and they voted in favor of China. So that makes the stakes higher when it comes to geopolitics, and that is a consideration that is now very much valid.
All right, Professor Mordi. President Biden hinted at the possibility of having Africa joining the G20 as a permanent member, which on face value would be a good idea. But then a lot of people, especially in Nigeria, would think that, yes, President Muhammadu Buhari has traveled widely, traveled a lot, during his 7.5, going to 8 years reign now. But they think, many people do feel, that he has not engaged sufficiently well. And my question to you, therefore, will be that now that it looks like Africa is the bride to the world, to America, to China, to Russia, what will you want those who are trying to take over from President Muhammadu Buhari do better when one of them becomes the president? We have seen 3 of the major candidates going to America, Peter Obi, former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, even Kwakwanso, visiting American state officials. We have seen the candidate of the APC, Bola Tinubu, also going to Chatham House, talking about the sort of shape that his government, if he's voted into power, will take in terms of foreign relations. What will be your words for them as to doing a lot better than President Muhammadu Buhari has done? And then what will be your assessment of Mr. Biden's desire to have Africa joining the G20 on a permanent basis?
Okay, well, just to say that Chatham House is in the UK and not in the US. But I guess the point is, it's also...
Yeah, that's what I said, that yes, that Tinubu might not have visited America, but he was in Chatham House in London, of course.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
Right. Okay, and the UK is a significant player, at least for Nigeria, without a shadow of a doubt. I would say a lot of this would depend on the specific domestic agenda of each candidate and how that dovetails into these external relationships. So if you look at our current fiscal situation, is highly constricted. Nigeria is in a very difficult fiscal situation. So just to fund our budgets, we have to resort to borrowing, not just domestic, but also external borrowing, because we have a revenue crisis. The revenue level outstrips our expenses. I talk less of capital expenses, just even recurrent expenses. And even debt servicing already in some months outstrips our revenue. So the economic agenda, if you have an agenda that is going to drive transformative change, which is what the country desperately needs, then funding that change, the level of capital required to fund that change is not available in terms of domestic capital because of low level of gross capital formation. So you have to resort to borrowing, external borrowing, to fund that. And having a partner that can provide the form of borrowing, either in terms of outright borrowing or partnerships, there are creative ways of funding infrastructure and funding other projects, right, will be a critical success factor for that economic agenda. So this will depend a bit on the agenda, a lot on the agenda of each of these candidates. But having said that, the nature of that partnership, and the keyword here is partnership, with the US and with other external actors, has to be one that enhances the productive capacity of the economy, one that can drive job creation and therefore pull people out of poverty, and one that can drive growth that is sustainable. That kind of partnership is not about receiving aid, which is useful as a targeted intervention, but is one where you could have access to capital and to some technical resources that are required for that. I'll give you a very quick one. If you think of the largest, most sustained economies on the globe now, you're going to think of Japan, you're going to think of Germany, you're going to think of South Korea, you're going to think of countries like, and China, who we're talking about now. Each of these countries owes growth to the United States. The Marshall Plan drove the growth you saw in Germany, building after the war, particularly Japan. After the Korean War, massive investments in South Korea, capital investments, led to the sort of development you're seeing in South Korea, which outperforms massively if you look at its population or its per capita compared to other economies. right? You look at China, after the most favorable trade nation status was going to China, and the US started investing in China and trading with them, the Chinese economy started growing massively. So Africa needs something similar, an intervention that is economic and one that drives productivity and growth. And any of these candidates will be well served to look at how they want to engage the United States and indeed all the external players in accessing capital, massive capital that is well targeted, that would drive productivity increases and would drive economic growth and therefore reduce poverty.
All right, productivity and growth, that's a thought to hold. And when we return, we'll carry on. But we're going to take a very quick break. Professor Chika Mordi, stay with us. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We've been talking to Professor Chika Mordi on the heels of the US-Africa Summit earlier in the week. All right, thanks for staying with us, Prof. Let's stay on the President Biden support for the African Union joining the G20, which, of course, is a global forum for major economies. Now, surely this move will buy African countries a bigger say in a diverse range of issues. But let's look at accessing a common framework for restructuring their debts, which Steve also touched on earlier. How effective could we expect this to be?
Well, there's history to it. If you remember, during the Obasanjo regime, Nigeria went into a program where a significant amount of the external debt was forgiven under the HIPAC program. There's something similar I would argue is actually necessary, because a lot of countries are touching on the verge of liquidity, what we call bankruptcy, if you're thinking of a corporate. So that is necessary. But unlike the HIPAC program, when it happened, you have a lot of debt this time that is owed not just to the IFIs, the IMF and the other IFIs and the World Bank, as well as the Western Club of Creditors. But this time around, there is debt that is owed to actors like China, and there's been a lack of transparency in terms of those debts, the conditions for the terms of those debts and the conditions and the overall aggregate in some cases. So if there is a solution, it would be useful that does not include China, but it would be even better if you can have China, the Gulf states, and other creditors that are significant on the continent to be part of a package. So I feel there's space for this, and it's something that is workable. But perhaps it should be expanded, that framework, to even include these other players. We could argue about how realistically we expect them to participate in the program. But the reality is, if those countries don't have increased fiscal space, then whatever benefits, whatever existing loans and whatever benefits that these other countries are hoping to tap from that relationship will be under threat.
All right, Prof. African Union's Agenda 2063, of course, was very well touched on by both parties during the summit, with America, President Biden promising support for the AU's agenda. However, I'm sure you also followed what President Muhammadu Buhari said, the fears that he expressed about what could work against that agenda, the next 5 decades and where the Union is proposing that Africa ought to be. President Muhammadu Buhari mentioned issues of climate change, of terrorism, of coups in Africa, and a few other things that are slowing down the clock of growth in Africa. What do you make of what the president said, President Muhammadu Buhari? And if you tie that to what the Senegalese president also mentioned, does it look like AU is thinking that what he set out to do might not be achievable in the long run?
Okay, well, I chuckle because I've been around the block long enough, and you too as well, to see a lot of those programs that project decades into the future, and then we kind of forget about them as they approach and we look for the next one. And some of them have been useful. I mean, without the SDG goals and the high-pack initiative that led to debt restructuring and forgiveness probably would not have happened, right? So, but it's still so far out that perhaps we want to look at what is immediate. Many of those points are valid. Climate change is real. There has to be a concerted effort to drive climate change. But with that, there has to be climate equity. There has to be far more aggressive interventions because in terms of not only the solutions and how the efficacy of the solutions, but even in terms of just justice and equity. Africa is looking to emerge in terms of development and industrialization. And if it will be very unfair to hold back the continent for climate considerations without sharing whatever cost it will be if you want to have cleaner ways of driving that to the countries that have benefited and have created most of this cumulative greenhouse gas emissions over the years or over the decades. Yeah, so I think, and I don't want to be cynical, perhaps what is most important is for us to begin to make the existing parks and the compacts they have, the agreements, the various bodies, and the nearer term commitments to work. And as we look very far up there, you first have to deal with where you are now. So if a person is in a well drowning, they could very much plan on where they want to be 5 miles away, but they first have to get out of the well and be alive before they can make that journey.
All right. In all, are you optimistic? What's your general sentiment around on the heels of this entire summit, Prof?
It's a very cautious sort of optimism. It's not the first of its kind. As you know, China, the big powers now have a habit of inviting the African leaders over to their country for a summit. A single country inviting 50 plus leaders, and they get typically close to 50. So China did this. They've had a summit. You saw this happen with India. You've seen that happen with some weaker effort, but you saw that happen also with Russia. And so it's beyond the summit. We have to see substantial policy sets that are actually implemented, and also we want to see a permanent resident on the continent. And what I mean by that is a change in government in the US saw a reduced level of engagement. After the Biden regime, or if President Biden doesn't have a second term, what will be the impact on this relationship? So we have to have the US as a more permanent resident on our continent, the way China has become more permanent. And we have to see some action behind this policies. But most importantly, the philosophy behind it has to be one that is about partnering with Africa for interventions that drive economic growth, and not partnering with Africa. It's not giving aid to Africa and just working out of pity to help reduce the misery that is very often portrayed on the continent.
All right, Prof, before we wind down, let's bring the discussion home a bit. President Muhammadu Buhari, of course, will be returning to Nigeria as a celebrated man, as a celebrated Democrat, courtesy of the kind words from President Joe Biden. However, he's got slightly more than 5 months to go. What would you like to see him do in the remaining 5 months so that he doesn't, it's not just all about, yes, supervising an election that will produce a successor, but then the lives of more than 200 million Nigerians are still at stake, and he's still the president in charge. So first, what would you like him to do while he's still got 5+ more months to go? And secondly, what sort of discourse do you think should shape the election that we have in about 2-3 months now, February and March? The president is 80 today, by the way. So the question of age has been part of the discourse. The question of fitness has been part of the discourse. The question of how much of allowance will you give to independent press, to express themselves, has been part of the discourse. What would you like to see in the type of, in what will shape whoever will come after President Muhammadu Buhari?
Well, that's a lot. Let me unpack that. So I think that there are two elements to the question. One is sort of about what the president should do in
Yes.
this lame duck period, because make no mistake, it's a lame duck period. I feel that just a bit before the primaries, there's been a sort of change in the degree of engagement, not just of the president, but indeed of most public, most elected officials. But one thing, many of them are either working to get elected or working for people who are trying to get elected. It's a very short period. And of course, after the election on February 25th, which happens to be my birthday, you're going to see it's going to be even more of a limited period, right? I feel given the country an election that is credible is the number one priority. I like fair and fair, people like to say, but just a credible election where the outcome reflects the will of the voters will be very important, very, very important legacy to bequeath to the country. Now, if a man is going to spend 8 years and he has done more than 7.5 years, or it's close to 7.5 years, I don't know how much change can happen in that short period. But we've seen, to be fair to the president, we've seen in the course of this year a couple of things that I would say we're seeing some things that are much better than they were in the last 7 years with his regime. And in the space of elections, the last 3 off-cycle elections, the gubernatorial elections in Ekiti State, Anambra State, and Osun State, were credible elections, and they appear to produce the outcome that the electorate desired. If the same thing can be done with the 2023 elections, then it will be a great legacy, and it will be a very important factor in where the country goes, because it's almost at an inflection point. Now, the second part of your question is about the candidates and what should be done or what we should be looking at. I think obviously the country needs a very dramatic change in direction. Okay, in terms of where the economy is going, in terms of the security situation, which is linked to that, in terms of the revenue that the government generates, in terms of how they spend that money. So the first point of order, obviously, parallel points of order, to be honest, one is to improve the security situation. The other is to begin to increase the revenue. These are not Gordian knots that need to be untied. But it's pretty straightforward. If we can increase our oil production by reducing the amount of oil theft, for one, then the revenue situation is going to change dramatically. The security situation, if we can cap that, is going to improve economic activity. Right. So these are the first two things that they need to work with while now driving the agenda for transformative change. Now, that candidate obviously has to be someone who is competent, someone who understands the nature of the problem and the workings of government, someone who's credible to drive an agenda, and someone who has an agenda that is both pragmatic and superior to past agendas that have been pushed. Because typically when canvassing for votes, we've seen very nice, what I would call declaratory policies, even when in office, but it's not translated to policies that work for the people, or a commitment even to those policies that were declared. So this time around, I believe the electorate needs to look out for a candidate that ticks these boxes, policy-wise, having a credible agenda, having the credibility to drive that agenda, and having the character and competencies to that.
All right.
But Prof, just before we let you go, the election will hold on your birthday, and we do congratulate you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I don't know if you'll be around to vote, but whether you're around or not, have you found a candidate that fits the bill of what you have just described?
And Steve, you put me on the spot. I think I'm agnostic in terms of my comments. My comments, as you could probably observe, I'm trying hard not to be partisan. Mm-hmm. So I would appeal that I hold to my chest who that candidate is. But I think a vote is like a prayer. if you're spiritual, a vote is like a prayer. When you vote, you're basically praying for the future, your future, for the outcome that candidate can drive. And I think it's pretty clear which candidate can drive that future. And so when you vote, don't think in isolation that my vote doesn't affect my future. But Nigeria is a very religious country. Everyone is either a Christian or Muslim, or very few who have other means of worship. And they go to churches and mosques all the time to pray for a better country. But by far the most important prayer that God will listen to is that vote, because it's sort of in your hands. There's no use praying to God to change our future, but your prayer in terms of your vote has a contrary future. And so Nigerians should think deeply about who they vote for, and that would influence our future.
All right, very aptly put. Your vote is your prayer. I want to thank you so much, Professor Chika Mordi, for joining us this morning. Always a pleasure to have you here.